Chapter 31 Mutual Concealment. Atop Mount Othrys. Having obtained the Codex of Creation from Lane, Themis didn't stop for a moment and hurried to the Mount of the Gods. Legislating for the world wasn't something that could be done casually. A fitting godhood, a sufficiently powerful vessel, the interim world steward, and the divine king's authorization, each of these was indispensable. However, Themis didn't worry that her younger brother would refuse her request. After all, the position of the divine king was not immutable. As for Cronus, not to mention the 500-year limit had not yet been reached. Even if it had, his divine authority could definitely not compare with that of his father. Despite Uranus's retrograde and contrary actions, his deed of birthing life through union was, in itself, the greatest achievement of the divine king. Moreover, Cronus was a usurper, and the divine power he obtained was bound to be even lower. To be able to accomplish legislation during his own reign, this new divine king would undoubtedly be desperate for it. 3 days later, Themis finally returned to the Mount of the Gods and immediately sought out her younger brother, explaining her ideas to him in detail. However, contrary to what the goddess of justice had anticipated, although Cronus was very supportive of her legislation, he seemed to be more interested in the god of spirit. So you're saying he not only made no demands on you, but also promised to deal with the chaos and madness expelled from the laws on your behalf? Yes, I thought they would gather on the land, creating many perilous dead zones, since I can't deal with them. But since Prince Lane is interested in them, I agreed to hand them over to him. A bit puzzled by the focus of Cronus's concern, Themis still answered. She guessed that Lane must have had some intent, but she didn't care. Those things were useless to her. Keeping them would only cause her trouble. Although Themis took it lightly, Cronus did not see it the same way. He had harbored resentment towards Lane for more than just a day or two. It's not that simple. There must be something you don't know. Lane will definitely gain something in the process. He is not the kind of person to act out of the goodness of his heart. With a cold snort, Cronus's expression turned somewhat unsightly. 300 years had passed, and although the power brought by his own godhood was insignificant, the greater part of the divine authority he had consolidated still granted him the formidable power of divine power level 17. But even so, whenever he thought of the origin power he had lost, Cronus deeply regretted the decisions he had made in the past. Divine power level is one thing, actual combat power is another. With the loss of most of his time-space godhood, even if the divine power level was the same, Cronus's strength was greatly reduced compared to before. What's more, if his time-space godhood had remained intact, his current divine power would have been one level higher. In the realm of powerful divine forces, the gap between levels is not something that those below intermediate divine power can compare to. Meanwhile, observing Cronus's expression, Themis was obviously misunderstanding. She thought he was angry about Lane's past prophecy. But as the goddess of justice, she wouldn't act on misplaced anger, so she spoke up to remind him. I know, Cronus, because of Prince Lane's prophecy, you and our brothers all harbor discontent towards him. But you should remember, at least for you, you not only proactively sought the prophecy from him, but you also owe him 2 favors. You once swore to the world to fulfill them. After 200 years, once you fully inherit the position of the divine king, you cannot delay any longer. Cronus was somewhat at a loss for words. He cursed Chaos's rigid instincts in his heart once again. Even though that god of spirit had done something to displease the world, and even though he had encroached on his own origin, to the world, it was always about the deed, not the person. Even its instinctive disgust for Lane, who stole source power, would not prevent it from honoring Cronus's promise. I will, but there are still 200 years, are there not? In the end, Cronus still accepted the fact that he had to work for Lane and turned to ask another question. You said he has opened up a domain called the Spirit Realm, which contains many special beings? Yes, Themis nodded. I plan to visit the Mother Goddess after he returns the life vase and create some new life on the earth as well. New life. Now that you mention it, I have seen some. Cronus furrowed his brows slightly, recalling, about 100 years ago, the god of destruction, Kur, representing the 8 gods residing in the underworld, came to Mount of the Gods to see me. At that time, some beings called nymphs of eternal night were following him. They were not deities, nor did they possess divine authority as quasi-gods. According to him, they were servants bestowed by Mother Night, the ancient god Nyx. In fact, Cronus had beautified the process. Kur didn't come to represent the 8 gods to pay homage to the divine king. He came purely to show off in front of the new divine king. Indeed, the deities of chaos were mostly very emotional. The divine king was still alone, but Kur had attendants with him, which satisfied Kur's vanity to a great extent and secretly angered Cronus. But there was nothing he could do, for according to Kur's statement, he had a close relationship with his mother goddess, and the new divine king did not dare to provoke a primordial god at this time. Of course, what Cronus did not know was that the god of destruction had also beautified his own process of obtaining the nymphs of eternal night. In his account, the 2 ancient primordial gods were very concerned about their divine children, but in reality, the twin gods of the dark night had hardly ever met with them. Erebus completely ignored his own offsprings of bodily evolution, and Lady Night, only out of nominal consideration, had given a few of the nymphs she created with spiritual embryos to them. None of them were endowed with divinity and transformed into demigods by Lady Night, not at all like the evidence of closeness between mother and child as Kur had claimed. Hadn't Mother Night sought out Prince Lane before? Themis speculated. It might have been at that time that he and Princess Nyx created new life together. Perhaps, Cronus replied. But since Princess Nyx has accepted the existence of the new life, there should be no problems with them. When the time comes, I'll go with you to see the Mother Goddess. The chaos terrain should also have some life that knows to revere the divine king. Frowning slightly, Themis felt some dissatisfaction. Lane had created life in his own realm, and Cronus's first reaction was actually, there might be problems? At least in her memory, Lane did not seem to have actively done anything to the Titans. You don't understand. Cronus shook his head and glanced at the face of the goddess of justice, but in the end, he said no more. He certainly didn't wish to broadcast his flawed thinking all over the world. If possible, he would rather nobody knew about the deficit in the origin of his godhood. Let's leave it at that for now, Themis. By the time you've completed the draft of the Codex, I'll probably have already taken control of the throne of the Divine King. Then, I will support your actions in the name of the Divine King. That would be for the best. Nodding, the goddess of justice still didn't discuss Lane with Cronus in depth. To her, legislating was the most important matter at hand. The past 300 years were far from enough for her to understand all the loopholes in the current worldly laws. Now, with the help of the Codex of Creation, she could delve deeper into the rules of the world. Chapter 32 Métis. Since Themis left the Mount of the Gods, in the blink of an eye, another 500 years had passed. In the Chaos world, time was so valueless that this remained the case even after the appearance of the first generation of humans. It was not until the era of bronze humanity that the gods grew accustomed to counting time in years rather than centuries. 300 years ago, on Mount Othrys, Cronus truly became the divine king. Driven by his oath, he declared the new rules of the sun and the moon in the name of the divine king, and the few remaining concepts associated with the moon completely flowed into the spirit realm. As expected, the future goddess of the moon, aside from having a glowing celestial body of her own, wouldn't be able to control anything else. Even the light emitted by the moon, apart from being called moonlight, had no mystical significance whatsoever. In regard to the second oath, Cronus also announced Lane's sovereignty over the elements and the qualification to weave the net to control them. The power of the elements thus flowed towards the spirit realm, but aside from the fire element, the influence of the other elements was mostly superficial. Although there were no wind gods yet, wind was subordinate to meteorology. Water, earth, light, and darkness all had their respective deities. Only fire had not yet found one. Therefore, it was not surprising that there would be a future fire god who could not control the fire element. Moreover, as Lane fully embraced the source power of the fire element, he could further touch the true fire, bringing this unclaimed natural godhood into his control. In the future, even if a fire god was born in chaos, she would merely be a deity presiding over the burning of physical matter. Henceforth, the fire of the spirit could harm the material, but the material fire could not touch the spirit. In the realm of spirituality, Lane defined fire as the primal one. Beyond that, during these 500 years, chaos witnessed many divine births and celestial events. The most widely known among them was the birth of the original god of sun, Helios, the eldest son of Hyperion. On the day this new god was born, the entire world saw the great sun shine 1,000 times brighter. The original sun godhood split in two, with the larger part reverting to the Titan ancient god, and the lesser portion to his child. Hyperion still represented the sun, but his eldest son represented the trajectory of the sun. There was no sunrise or sunset in the original chaos world, but now there were evening and dawn. And with the division of godhood, Hyperion, who was already approaching divine power level 18, suffered a great loss of vital essence, barely maintaining his strong divine power. Divine power could be sustained, godhood could be split, but the sun could not be duplicated. Thus, Helios, barely born, became a sun god without a Sunday. Since he lacked a celestial body corresponding to his godhood, Helios, though nearly a century old, still maintained the appearance of a child. Possessing a sun godhood of level 15, he was like the early Lane, merely a true god with feeble divine power. This Titan family drama certainly provided much amusement for the divinities of chaos. Apart from that, the second daughter of Ceus and Phoebe, the goddess of meteoristeria, was born. Chaos's sky now had an erratic celestial body. But to Ceus' surprise, his daughter only represented the celestial body itself. The light she emitted didn't even contain a trace of energy, even though she was also a type of star. Aside from these minor events in the sky, the ocean saw the birth of numerous deities. Oceanus, in particular, had a keen interest in procreating offspring. With the birth of hundreds of divine children, numerous rivers, lakes, and fountains sprung up on the earth, and the sovereign authority of the god of the ocean began to expand. Although, as the circumterrestrial river, Oceanus technically presided over distant seas and ocean currents, friction began to arise between him and the ancient sea gods as his offspring proliferated. Their godhood couldn't be stripped away, but that didn't mean those with similar domains wouldn't fight. Just as the land was ever expanding, the ocean was actually growing as well. The newly grown ocean didn't have innate ownership, and though it had been divided between the two sea gods, that didn't mean it would always continue this way. The two sea sovereigns didn't clash directly, but conflicts among their children were not uncommon. Nonetheless, Oceanus, while prolific, was discontented. He had only two true god children, and Styx resided in the underworld, scarcely heeding the commands of her own father. There was little he could do about this but to continue procreating with the original sea goddess, Thetis. In such an environment, Métis, later renowned in mythology as the goddess of wisdom and strategy, now the goddess of hydrology, was born. Congratulations, my brother. Another true god has emerged, and your divine lineage grows ever stronger. The god of meteorology said to his long-unseen elder brother within a palace far out at sea. Ever since Themis had built her temple on Mount Othrys. Soon after, big and small palaces began to proliferate throughout chaos. At least in the matter of indulgence, the chaotic gods learned quite quickly. And you will be soon too, won't you, Crius? I hear that you and Eurybia have come together, he said. Judging by the days, your first child should also be born soon, he added. With a lukewarm smile, Oceanus seemed not too enthusiastic. Beside him, Crius looked somewhat embarrassed. He was well aware that Oceanus was expressing his dissatisfaction. After all, it was common knowledge now that the ocean deity sovereign had a falling out with his uncle. Even though neither had come to blows, the two had ceased all communication for centuries. At such a time, Crius's choice of the ancient sea god's youngest daughter naturally upset him greatly. I know that you've had a conflict with Pontus, Crius said with a hint of helplessness. But there's absolutely no need for hostilities. So, on which side do you stand? Disregarding the pleasantries of the god of meteorology, Oceanus asked bluntly, "I will stay on Mount Othrys. I have no desire to come to blows with Eurybius' kin, but neither will I against you," Crius replied. Though he said this, Crius was acutely aware that for him, who had not yet become a god of great divine power, taking sides was not a good thing. "It's better that way, my brother," Oceanus said, casting a warning glance at Crius, then turned around and loudly announced to the gods who came to the celebration, "To celebrate the birth of my daughter, the goddess of hydrology, Metis, let us begin the festivities. Everyone present here is a friend of the ocean divine lineage." At these words, the tense atmosphere due to the two titans finally eased, and the gathering of gods began to enjoy the festivities, blessing the newborn as they indulged in the nectar of the banquet. This beverage, originating from the Mount of the Gods, became the favorite of all deities the moment it appeared, and no feast was complete without it. Rumor had it that it actually came from a deity in the underworld, but no one cared about its provenance. The gods only cared about one thing, that the nectar was pleasurable, and that was enough for them. Before the palace, while the deities celebrated, in a place unseen by them, in the spirit realm, a figure arrived silently behind the ocean temple. When the spirit realm began spreading across the earth, Lane did not first choose the continents but opted instead for the more remote ocean. Now he stood in the first layer of the spirit realm, looking at the small infant on the outer bed, his expression hesitant. She was Metis, who originally presided over strategy, wisdom, thought, and hydrology, the first wife of the third-generation divine King Zeus, and the mother of the goddess Athena. But now, she was just a weak infant with control over hydrology. Chapter 33: The Move. Unlike the offspring of the primordial gods, the progeny of the second generation of divine beings needed to develop. They no longer matured in a mere half-day after birth, like their parents did. Some took months, others an indefinite period. Their growth rates varied. At the same time, the new gods did not possess innate, powerful divine powers. Even the ancient titans had at least weak divine power at birth, but these new gods, except for very few, mostly started from divine power level 1 and slowly grew from there. Now, Metis before Lane's eyes was just like that. Her newborn skin was as smooth as milk, and her pair of black, lustrous eyes didn't resemble those of a newborn at all. But without a doubt, it would take decades for her to become an adult deity. This was not only because this was how it should be for the third generation of gods, but also because her origin was not strong. When she was born, wisdom, thought, and strategy automatically scattered throughout the heavens and the earth, much like memory once had, leaving her with only hydrology. Unlike Mnemosyne, however, the third-generation gods were not born with knowledge, so she would not realize that she was meant to have these powers. Metis, Athena, perhaps I should take her away? Muttering softly, Lane was not worried about being discovered. Oceanus and Theseus were indeed strong, but as long as he didn't show himself near them, it was hard for them to detect him. This was the absolute nature of divine authority. When Lane hid within history, and with the spirit realm as cover, even if there was only a room apart, no one could sense his presence. Never mind. Although destiny has been altered, I still hope the world remains familiar until Zeus ascends the throne. Moreover, in the original trajectory, the goddess of wisdom didn't seem all that clever. Shaking his head, Lane eventually gave up on his plan. With Metis's potential, if he took her back to the spirit realm and nurtured her carefully, she would be capable of holding some powerful godhoods. For instance, Script. Its origin flowed towards the spirit realm every moment. Normally, the presence of the god of Script would to some extent block Lane's absorption of Script, but unfortunately, the Oracle Stone Tablet possessed an even more orthodox source power of Script. Under these circumstances, having another person in charge of a godhood would not only accelerate the spirit realm's absorption rate but would also bring Lane a powerful subordinate in the future. But in the end, he abandoned this idea. A goddess of wisdom who couldn't even discern her own safety. How was such wisdom any different from Prometheus's forethought? In comparison, Perhaps her daughter would be a more fitting spokesperson for wisdom. Having made his decision, Lane stretched out his hand, and 3 multifaceted crystals silently appeared before him. The spirit realm's absorption of the 3 great godhood origins had just begun, but that did not prevent Lane from solidifying the corresponding godhoods. Even though they were weak now, as the spirit realm absorbed all the scattered origins, they too would return to their rightful heights. With a gesture, the 3 crystals fell into the body of the infant girl before him. Simultaneously, Lane's figure vanished in an instant. The next moment, the ocean deity sovereign appeared directly beside the bed. He looked around, but found nothing. The instant Lane conferred the godhoods, he returned from history to the present. Oceanus immediately sensed something amiss but was incapable of tracking Lane's presence. What is it? Soon after, Thesis also appeared here. The goddess wasn't previously in the temple, but sensing her husband's sudden burst of divine power, she quickly rushed back. It's nothing, might have been my illusion. Shaking his head, Oceanus prepared to return. But as his gaze swept over his daughter, his expression suddenly froze. Is this the aura of the godhood of wisdom? A bit uncertain, Oceanus picked up his daughter, carefully sensing the aura within her. Soon, he not only confirmed his previous sensing but also discovered additional auras of strategy and thought. Was Métis gifted with other godhoods by the world? Did you sense the presence of chaos just now? Thesis also noticed the anomaly in her daughter. But since chaos had never shown the phenomenon of transferring godhood outside of the subgods, she instinctively thought it to be a gift from the world. Perhaps, but that's not important anymore. The ocean deity sovereign was not entirely sure, but he was indeed very surprised. Unlike Pontus's selective breeding strategy, he was synonymous with casting a wide net. Among his many children, only Styx had a godhood that allowed her to reach intermediate divine power level, while the rest like Clymene and Métis with fame and hydrology, found even achieving weak divine power level a challenge. But now, with wisdom, strategy, and thought, Métis was destined to become a powerful being like her eldest sister. At least intermediate divine power level, and in the distant future possibly even a mighty divine power level, that would be much stronger than many of the ancient Titan gods. My brother Iapetus once sought a wife from me, and though he made no demand, my daughters who are less than true gods do not match his status. I was initially inclined to choose between Clymene and Métis, but it seems now that I don't need to choose. Oceanus was very pleased, and Thesis nodded in agreement. Bearing many children and spreading the influence of the ocean god's lineage across the world, forging alliances with deities through marriage, this was their plan from the beginning. The mythology of later generations also proved his success. Unlike his other brothers, besides Rhea and Themis, the ocean deity sovereign was the only ancient Titan god who still retained some influence in the era of Zeus. I will discuss this matter with Clymene. As the goddess of renown, marrying a noble Titan also suits her godhood well. She will be satisfied with this. As Oceanus's wise and supportive wife, Thesis voluntarily took on this task. Good. I hope she can bear my brother a powerful deity. In this way, when we face my uncle in the future, we will have one more ally. Nodding to his wife, Oceanus got up and headed to the front hall. His abrupt departure had surely sparked much speculation among the guests, but now he could cheerfully share the good news with them. From this day forth, the name Métis the Wise would resound throughout the sea, and no one could criticize him any more with only quantity, with Styx being just an exception. Behind him, Thesis took another look at her daughter, and then she too left the grand hall. She had been previously monitoring the currents, preparing to extract the essence from her husband's domain to combine with her godhood, nurturing a divine artifact. This primitive method of artifact creation was quite ordinary, not as powerful as those made by the Cyclops who had special talents in smithing, but it was still sufficient to serve as a symbol for the ocean deity sovereign. Thesis was going to continue preparing for this. As for her daughter Métis, gods are immortal. She did not need to be looked after all the time. Chapter 34. Desire gives birth to love. Love gives birth to beauty. In the ocean temple, Lane bestowed godhood, and in the next moment, he utilized the properties of the spirit realm to leave his original location. Beyond Mount Sinai, the space-time of the spirit realm became increasingly chaotic the deeper one ventured. Beyond the third layer, one entered the deep layers of the spirit realm, where a single step forward could mean traveling 1,000 miles in the real world. Although currently only the first 2 layers of the spirit realm had been completely structured, this did not prevent Lane from leveraging the characteristics of other dimensions. Thus, in an instant, he arrived at the sea surface thousands of miles away. This was still due to the spirit realm's coverage being too small in the present world. Otherwise, with the movement method Lane called Spiritual Realm Shuttle, he could travel between the 2 sides of the Earth in a matter of minutes. When living beings are born on the Earth, and my divine power accumulates to level 16 or above, I can weaken the barrier between the surface of the spirit realm and the real world. By then, life forms with innate intuition could directly see into the first layer of the spirit realm, and spirits that are deeply resolute or honored with rituals can stay in the shallow spirit realm, continuing to exist in another form. Contemplating in his heart, Lane looked back in the direction of the ocean palace. Later generations would say that much of Zeus's wisdom came from Métis, yet now the godhood of Métis had been conferred by Lane. But it's hard to say. Rather than attributing Zeus's wisdom to Métis, I'm more inclined to believe he just borrowed her name, swallowing a deity to use her divine authority, as if it were that easy. Besides, if Zeus managed to deceive the goddess of wisdom, his sweet talk is probably not inferior to Métis's wisdom. Shaking his head, Lane continued on his way to a location near the coast, following the direction in his memory. Having diligently absorbed Origin for 800 years in the spirit realm, Lane had no intention of immediately going back upon finally emerging. At the very least, he intended to retrieve something from that place. We've arrived. 7 days later, after crossing the vast sea, Lane reached a peculiar sea surface. There were no waves here. The surface of the sea was as still as death. Yet, when the sunlight shone upon it, it possessed a divine beauty. Not far away, a layer of blood foam emitting desire and hatred floated in place. This was the source of all anomalies in this sea area, and even Pontus himself was reluctant to come near. This was where the organs of Uranus had fallen, imbued with his hatred for the Titans and Pontus. In the future, the Erinyes and Aphrodite would be born here, as the birthplace of 4 deities. Once the blood of the divine king dissipated, this place too would become a sacred sea area. Who are you? This is the domain of the nearby Sea Lord. Strange deity, state your name. Suddenly, along with a somewhat strange tone, a half-snake, half-fish creature emerged. She eyed Lane not far away with caution but did not act rashly, as the aura of divine power on him informed her that this was at least a deity with intermediate divine power. As one of Pontus's 5 offspring, she, like her brother and husband Phorcys, was a life form that was half demigod and half monster. Together, they had sired many sea monsters, the most famous being the Grayi sisters. They appeared as old women but shared 1 eye and 1 tooth among the 3. They each ruled over venom, brutality, and terror, but they were not true gods. They were quasi-gods who held powers and possessed immortality, akin to the Oceanides without godhood. Keto, danger of the sea, I know of you. Lane didn't look at her, nor did he answer her question. Compared to Eurybia, the power of the sea, and Nereus, the friendly sea deity, Keto and her brother were more like Cyclops, disliked by all deities of chaos. There was no helping it. The gods of chaos have always been superficial. But I do not know you, strange deity. This is a forbidden sea area transformed by the Father God, a fact known to all deities. Keto's expression grew increasingly unfriendly, particularly affected by her instincts compared to regular deities. That's not important, Lane said, an interesting thought suddenly emerging in his heart. What's important is, do you want to change your appearance? To get rid of your current form, or at least, to have another form that can be recognized by the gods. Keto's increasingly ferocious face stiffened. Lane's persistent irrelevance was somewhat infuriating to Keto, who, being somewhat controlled by her beastly nature, had intended to follow her instincts and attack Lane. But his subsequent words immediately brought her back to her senses. She had claimed more than once that she didn't care about her appearance, but only she knew her thoughts when the god's banquet turned her away at the door. What should I do? Her voice suddenly softened, though Lane could tell that this softness was still harsh to the ears. Without playing coy, Lane pointed towards the foam of blood in front of him. Drink it, of course, only a small part of it. If you dare swallow it all, you'll only serve as a vessel, birthing for new deities. But if you take just a few sips, maybe you'll gain more than you expect. Keto hesitated. Known as the peril of the sea, she was very aware that this place was the most dangerous part of these waters, and the source of the danger was this blood. She didn't know whether she should believe this stranger deity's words, but she was too desperate for change. To drink or not is up to you, but this might be your only chance. Extending his hand, Lane scooped a spoonful from the blood before him, then with a flicker, vanished silently from the surface of the sea. In coming here, he had done so for this particular reason. Encountering Keto was an unexpected bonus. Wait! Hurriedly speaking out, Keto wanted Lane to elaborate. But Lane clearly had no time for her. His casual reminder was merely for his own amusement, like watching a spectacle for fun. Damn it! With a roar, but driven by a deep-seated longing, Keto still turned her gaze to the blood foam. After a long while, her ferocious face showed a struggle, but in the end, Keto's desire for beauty overpowered her instincts. She no longer cared about the danger of the blood before her and gulped it down. As the blood entered her stomach, her appearance indeed began to change. At a certain moment, she stopped drinking and looked at her reflection on the sea's surface. A beautiful goddess with black hair appeared there, the wildness in her eyes adding a touch of allure. Yet at that moment, Keto felt no joy. Instead, she felt envy towards those who were truly beautiful. She knew she had now become a goddess of beauty, but it was a dressed-up beauty, a false disguise of loveliness. Simultaneously, she understood under the influence of godhood that the true deity symbolizing love and beauty would be born from these blood foams in the future, and her disguise would be meaningless in front of them, serving only as a backdrop for the flowers. Nothing is everlasting without change. One day, I will become true beauty. If not, then let them all die. As long as there is no one more beautiful than me, then I will still be the epitome of beauty. Her voice was no longer raspy, but the pleasant tone spoke cruel words. Keto looked at the blood foam on the sea and silently swore an oath in her heart. The future goddess of love and beauty was destined to be her enemy. After a long stare, when the sun set, Keto still left that place. Following her memory, she headed towards the palace of a deity, where a gathering seemed to be taking place. The future was still distant, but now, she wanted to experience what it was like for the other deities to enjoy a banquet. This time, she wouldn't be rejected. Chapter 35. A Gathering of Gods. Lane casually created a different kind of goddess of beauty and didn't take it to heart. In later generations, Keto actually didn't have much presence. Only her monstrous offspring appeared in the epics of humans to highlight the great achievements of the demigod heroes. As a monster herself, compared to the king of all monsters, Typhon, she wasn't even a match for one of Typhon's many children. However, now, as the goddess Keto, perhaps she may leave some new traces in the history of chaos. 700 years had passed since the birth of Métis and the rebirth of Keto. The world doesn't revolve around one person. Despite Lane living a secluded life for 700 years, it didn't affect the increasing prosperity of the world of chaos at all. 100 years after returning to the spirit realm, a bright moon once again hung in the sky of chaos, which had been dim for 900 years. That was Selene, the daughter of Hyperion and Thea, the moon goddess. This powerful goddess, which should have been in her original trajectory, seemed particularly weak since she had lost all concepts related to the moon. Her limit was the realm of weak divine power, and she could be thankful that the moon was the largest luminary in the night sky. This matter greatly annoyed Hyperion. He had suppressed his own son because the sun could not be divided, but his daughter Selene should have been his best assistant in ruling the stars. Instead, she turned out to be a great disappointment. Because of this, Hyperion hesitated for a long time, but he ultimately went to the underworld. After all, in his view, as long as he did not seek a prophecy from Lane and let himself be caught in the web of fate, the so-called God of Spirit was nothing to fear. The twin gods of the Dark Night who had once retreated were probably entangled by the same mistake of the two generations of divine kings, because they were restrained by prophecy. Therefore, Hyperion searched throughout the underworld. He tried to find Lane to have him return the concept of the moon. The god of the sun was unwilling to trouble himself for a sister he was not close to, but it was different for a daughter who held the promise of becoming a powerful deity. However, facing Hyperion's actions, Lane simply couldn't be bothered, and so after several years of searching, the god of sun could only release his power and frustration around the nether moon, unable to touch the light body that seemed so close at hand. Having returned without success, Hyperion then approached Cronus. He assumed that it was only because of the divine king's edict that Lane was able to take away Selene's power, and that if Cronus revoked that order, the concept of the moon would return to its rightful owner. But Cronus decisively refused. Not to mention that the previous matter regarding the moon was a vow he had made about the world. Even if it was not, he would not show a friendly face to this brother who had always been unpleasant. Moreover, Cronus knew very clearly what others did not. Referring to his own origin of time and space, he knew that the concept of the moon before it came together might indeed have been under Lane's control due to the authority of the divine king. But afterwards, it was likely a one-way journey. So, to cover up the true nature of his own origins deficit, Cronus was even less likely to agree to such an impudent request. Repeatedly rejected, Hyperion flew into a rage, but sensing the divine king's increasingly powerful aura, he felt somewhat helpless. In the end, he had no choice but to return to the sky, venting his anger on those around him. During that period, the sun in the sky capriciously released its power, causing the temperature of the entire world to rise. Fortunately, at that time, the earth was mostly inhabited by deities, so it didn't cause any disaster. However, because of this incident, the third generation of deities in Chaos also came to realize that in the underworld, there was an ancient god who controlled the nether moon and spirit who rarely ventured out. After a few more years, Astrius and Eos were born successively. The former was the child of the god of meteorology and the powerful sea god Eurybia, the god of the stars. The latter was Hyperion's second daughter, the goddess of dawn. Unlike the records in mythology, there was no violent drama this time. Or rather, Lane never really believed that part of the mythology had much authenticity. Rumors said that Eos, cursed by the goddess of love and beauty, could only fall in love with mortals, but given her later behavior, she didn't seem like any kind of prudish goddess. So, just over 100 years later, these two new gods came together spontaneously. They gave birth to the four wind gods as well as numerous star gods, most of whom were quasi-gods without godhood. Among the star gods, there was only one exception. She was Astrea, the star of justice, the goddess of purity. Although not very powerful as a bona fide true god, she was seen as a leader by all the star gods. The wind gods, the Anemoi, were much more powerful. They tore off parts of godhood from their own grandfather, the god of meteorology, representing the winds of the four directions. They were Boreas, the god of the north wind, Notus, the god of the south wind, Eurus, the god of the east wind, and Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. With their birth, the air currents of chaos became more variable. At the same time, on the earth and in the ocean, the Melee, three birch tree goddesses, and the three Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, were successively born. They were the transformation of the divine blood left by Uranus, the former called the Melee, and the latter called the Erinyes. Perhaps because the dangerous Keto of the sea had drunk the divine blood before the Furies were born, they regarded Keto as their eldest sister and stayed in the ocean with her. The three birch tree goddesses came to Mount Othrys to meet the divine king and were taken under the wing of Rhea, who had become the queen of gods. Elsewhere, on the Mount of the Gods, Iapetus also had his own divine child. With the daughter of the ocean deity Sovereign, his own niece Clymene, he successively fathered 3 deities, all of whom were well known in later generations. The first god of strength, later the bearer of the heavens, Atlas. The creator of bronze humanity, the forethought fire thief Prometheus, and the afterthought simpleton Epimetheus. Unlike his weaker brethren, from the day of his birth, Atlas showed extraordinary divine power and possessed the potential to become a great force. For this, the ocean deity Sovereign personally congratulated his nephew/grandson's birth and blessed him to never be invaded by the ocean. Of course, while his own brothers were striving hard, the prolific Oceanus was also busy. Over 700 years, thousands of children were born into the chaos world, and rivers and lakes started to spread across the earth. Most were territorial gods, but there were still several true gods among them. They were Eurynome, the water meadow deity; Perse, the boiling water goddess; Pronoia, the goddess of foresight; Doris, the gentle goddess; and Philyra, the healing goddess. As the number of children increased, the tension between Pontus and Oceanus intensified. Their offspring had fought a few battles at sea, but with no significant outcomes. But anyone with clear sight could see that if not for concern over the divine king on Mount Othrys, perhaps these 2 sea gods would have long since gone to war. Besides, during the birth of the many deities, something happened that puzzled the gods. It was roughly 1,000 years after Cronus took the throne, when many mountain gods and river gods noticed a verdant light flying out from underground, heading towards the abode of Mother Earth beside the East Sea. After that, the ground of chaos terrain inexplicably trembled for 3 years. It was Mother Earth's anger, but there were no further developments. Later, divine King Cronus came to visit Mother Earth to borrow the life vase, but returned empty-handed. It was not until the goddess of justice, the queen of gods Rhea, accompanied him that they obtained what they sought. However, to the disappointment of the 3 Titan deities, as the origin of life of chaos, the life vase indeed could create living beings, but none of them possessed consciousness. With no other choice, Themis had to give up the idea of creating life for the time being and continue with her preparations. So, hundreds of years passed by, and after 1,500 years of preparation, the preparations came to an end. It was on this day that the goddess of justice and law finally stood atop Mount Othrys, beginning to enact laws for the present world. Chapter 36 Legislation. Are you ready? At the summit of Mount of the Gods, in front of a complex of palaces, Cronus asked. Although he wasn't leading the legislation, as the divine king, he would also have a share of the world's rewards. Of course. Where is your decree? 1,200 years had not left a mark on Themis. Instead, years of toil had made her gaze even more steady and sharp. She looked at Cronus, demanding the last necessary item for the legislation. Use this, the scepter of divine authority. My brother, who dominates the outer seas, is enormously powerful, with progeny more numerous than all the deities of Chaos World, aside from Aria's mountain gods and the celestial lineage of star gods. Cronus spoke in an even tone, showing no particular emotion when talking about Oceanus. His former elder brother had fused the essence of the sea with the origin of godhood to smith the scepter of the Sea King for himself, thus commanding the great oceans. Cronus, following suit, forged a scepter of divine authority for himself. Yet, once the scepter of the Sea King appeared, thousands of sea deities followed its command. But Cronus's divine decrees have been largely ignored to this date. His authority does not extend beyond Mount of the Gods. Such is the current state of Cronus. Even the earth has long been occupied by a host of river gods, lake gods, and mountain gods. In their eyes, the rank of the divine king is a fact that hardly needs stating. Following behind others is not something to be proud of, Cronus. The gods will remember the first, but few know of the second. Themis, taking the scepter inlaid with 3 colored gems, reminded her brother. This was a sentence she had heard from Liana, and the goddess of justice found it quite sensible. For over 1,000 years, she had been visiting the spirit realm and then duplicating what she had learned on Mount Othrys. She did this not out of stealth, for Lane had been happy with her actions. Themis's conduct not only did no harm to his interests but actually accelerated his absorption of the related chaotic source force from Chaos World. Perhaps. But the strongest one is also the first, isn't it? The voice of Cronus had grown more confident than it had been hundreds of years earlier, or perhaps, the increasingly significant divine authority had given him that confidence, and he was beginning to plan to act. The Divine King had set 3 jewels in the scepter, hoping that one day he could command the sky, the earth, and the seas with it. Perhaps then, he might have the confidence to confront the curse left by the Heavenly Father, or even the unspeakable fate. However, unlike Cronus, Themis, in response to the Divine King, nodded but inwardly was not optimistic about her brother's prospects. Unless he possessed a power comparable to that of the primordial gods, becoming the true king of all gods, the strongest one would remain no more than an empty boast. And just relying on godhood, Cronus was completely unable to achieve this. The sky had the potential for great divine power, as the Heavenly Father was the embodiment of the sky. But even Cronus, though Themis did not know of his origin's deficiency, originally only embodied slightly more than 30% of the current world's spacetime origin. To become a true divine king, one must possess great power. But to obtain great power, Cronus could only rely on his position as divine king, which was essentially a vicious circle. In later generations, Zeus would break this cycle with faith, but the second-generation divine king had not that option at the time. "I am about to begin," Themis softly announced, no longer delaying. Everything was in readiness, and she was somewhat eager to start. Upon hearing this, Cronus quickly stepped aside. When the legislation began, the rules of the entire present world would converge here, and except for the lawgiver herself, even the primordial gods dared not come into direct contact with these endless chains of law at this time. After all, the so-called present world was in the eyes of the gods the consciousness of chaos. Including the anomaly of the law at the birth of a deity, it also only occurred in the present world and did not affect other places. The true complete chaos included everything in the world, but the side of order is what the gods were in contact with. This part included most of the sky, all the land, most of the oceans, and the core of the underworld. Beyond the present world lay the land of eternal night, the realm of lightless, the bottomless abyss, the edges of the starry heavens and the great seas, and some perilous areas of the underworld. There, the chaotic aspects of chaos predominated, and the powers of the gods could even be diminished in that region, accessible without impact only to those who had touched upon great divine power. Seeing Cronus retreat, Themis pursed her lips. She stepped forward, standing at the highest point of Mount of the Gods. In the next moment, the goddess of justice gripped the scepter of divine authority tightly, and the vast divine power began to surge within her. It was not just her intermediate divine power at work, but also a portion of the divine authority of the Divine King temporarily bestowed upon her by the scepter. Under the dual influence of divine power and divine authority, imperceptibly, a part of the innate consciousness of chaos, the law of the present world started to open its gates to the goddess guided by the godhood of law. Instantly, Themis seemed to see the chaotic source force accumulated between the chains of order. These remnants from the beginning of creation were common in the regions outside the present world. But in places dominated by order, their mere existence made the flow of law much more arduous. Thus, Themis raised her right hand. In complete silence, a brass-colored book, neither jade nor stone, opened its cover. On the tome initially engraved with calendars and the order of the spirit realm, new inscriptions began to emerge. As part of the pact, she used spirit script to write, reinforcing the initial spirit script connected to law. The divine power in her body churned increasingly. As inscriptions emerged on the Codex of Creation, strands of law materialized from the void, racing each other to flow towards the divine artifact. During this process, not only did the chains of law themselves seem to be purified, but also invisible forces emerged, silently infusing into the Codex, slowly enhancing its power. This invisible, high-quality force strengthened and rounded the aura of the divine artifact with every increment. Themis knew this was the attributeless source power transformed from the chaos. Apart from acting as a medium through the codex, this source power also continuously poured into her, becoming part of godhood of law. Though Themys's divine power did not increase, her limit had been opened. The path to powerful divine strength had been paved by her. Thus, under the watchful eye of Cronus and the secret observation of the Lord of the Spirit Realm, the goddess of law held high the codex and proclaimed to the law of the world, "I, bestowed by Chaos the master of law, the great ancient Titan God-born, the wielder of the divine authority of the divine king, the writer of the codex of creation. In the name of order, I hereby make a covenant for the present world." At the same time, the very moment Themis raised the codex of creation, an invisible ripple spread out. Every deity with intermediate divine power or greater in the chaos world turned their gaze towards Mount Othrys. There, the law of the present world was being rewritten. Chapter 37 Convergence. Unlike minor divine power and weak divine power, starting from intermediate divine power, deities could begin to make initial contact with the origin sea of the world. Godhood is the external manifestation of source power. Except for the world itself and great divine power, no intelligent being can easily touch the source itself, as this essential force of the world would only assimilate their thinking gradually. In the words of Lane's previous life, it was assimilation into the Tao. Therefore, chaos created godhood, and Lane formed the multifaceted crystal condensed from the source power. Only by adding a layer in between could the gods exercise their authority freely. However, just like a needle dropped into seawater, although the water cannot stop it, it's also difficult for the needle to cause any harm to the water itself. Once divine power stepped into intermediate divine power, gods were no longer as fearful of source power as if it were a fearsome beast, but instead could sense its rhythm to a certain degree, and even utilize this to deepen their understanding of their corresponding origin. And it was this sensing ability that allowed them to faintly perceive that at this moment, on Mount Othrys, the current laws of the world were converging, and some deity was influencing the arrangement of the rules. Themis had walked the earth for 1,000 years, and more than one god had witnessed her presence. The gods were well aware of what this goddess had done, but in their eyes, a being with intermediate divine power daring to amend the law was utterly impossible. Yet, the tremors from the origin sea forced them to change their minds now. Maybe this not-so-famous ancient Titan god was not arrogantly overestimating herself, but truly had some special method. And no matter what method Themis employed, the gods were very clear that as the laws of the present world were completed, her godhood of the law would undoubtedly be elevated. Great divine power, there was no question about it. Whether they wished to admit it or not, the gods could only accept that another deity capable of influencing the direction of the world was about to be born. "It's Themis. She said last time that she wanted to establish laws for the present world. I thought she was joking, but I never expected it to be true," one god said. Upon the sea, the primordial sea goddess stood beside her husband, speaking with certainty. "To establish laws for the present world. If she is successful, the ascended godhood of the law would be strong enough to support her in reaching the peak of great divine power. It looks like another strong figure is about to emerge from our generation of titans." Upon hearing this, Oceanus nodded. As the ocean deity sovereign, he was happy to see his sister's promotion come to fruition. Themis's godhood meant she would not interfere in his and Pontus's war. After all, as fellow sea gods, their conflict was deemed natural. "Let's set out, we shall go and congratulate her together." After watching for a while, Oceanus withdrew his gaze. Establishing laws for the present world was not a matter of 1 or 2 days, and there was enough time for him to reach Mount Othrys before it was completed. "It's been a long time since I returned, and I wonder how much the Mount of the Gods has changed from what it once was." In the underworld, the god of the sky, Ether, was surrounded by his brothers and sisters. Unlike the gods of the land above, the deities of the underworld were few and weak. Aside from the goddess of daylight's relatively strong godhood, only the god of destruction and the god of doom had a chance of stepping into intermediate divine power in the future. In the eyes of outsiders, even though they weren't strong, with the support of 2 primordial gods, Their special status was recognized by all the gods. But only they themselves knew that the primordial gods had never truly regarded them. Even the land of eternal night and the realm of lightness kept their distance from them. It wasn't that they were unable to enter, but like other gods, they did not know themselves whether they could return once they went inside. Kerr, I have warned you before not to go around causing trouble. Last time you went to Mount of the Gods, Cronus let it go in consideration of Mother, but that doesn't give you the reason to act rashly. No secret can be kept forever, and they will eventually learn the truth. When that time comes, no one knows whether he will use us to establish the authority of the Divine King. After all, unlike his Titan brothers, no one would stand up for us. Looking at his brother, Aether felt some irritation, even though he knew that Kerr had been somewhat influenced by his godhood. Is that so? If there really is such a day, let him come to me. You will likely be fine, since you're just about to go and show your loyalty to him, aren't you? With a cold laugh, Kerr was ungrateful. As a descendant of the primordial gods, even if his nominal parents did not acknowledge him, he still considered himself equal to the ancient Titan gods. In fact, gods like him were not uncommon in chaos. Deities were immortal, but that didn't mean they were particularly wise. You, Pontus, pointing a finger at his own brother, ultimately said nothing. Now, he completely understood why Hemera didn't want to be with them because, as she said, they were different. The sky and daylight, their godhood itself dictated that they did not fit in with the other 6 deities. I will go to Mount of the Gods to congratulate the Master of Law. As for you, if you don't want to go, then stay here. Shaking his head, Aether left with a flick of his sleeves. He needed to consider his sister's opinion. Perhaps compared to the underworld, the stars were where they truly belonged. Should we attend as well, Father? Gazing up at the sky that Aether had on his mind, the moon goddess Selene looked at Hyperion. Though she had been born hundreds of years ago, she still possessed weak divine power. Like all deities, she had an appearance mortals could hardly dream of reaching. And unlike in later times, gods of this era, even those weak but beautiful like her, were not worried about their predicament. On the contrary, many deities had expressed their affection to Selene, but she declined them all. Of course, Selene. Lane shamelessly stole the concept of moon, making you so weak. But when I tried to create a land of eternal night in the underworld, I never succeeded. I don't know how he did it, but as the goddess of justice and law, your aunt will uphold justice for you. Selene fell silent. She had heard many times from her father about that deity who resided in the underworld. His seizure of the concept of moon stemmed from a pact with Mother Earth and the Titans. She doubted her aunt would break her godhood for her father. Still, considering her own power, she resigned herself to her fate. The current family of the sun god was different from before. The eldest son and daughter both had feeble divine power, while the once subordinate goddess of dawn was stronger than her siblings. Helios's weakness was at least because he had no opportunity to revolve the sun to enhance his divine power, but his godhood was still powerful. But Selene, she did not want to remain weak forever. Maybe I can find a powerful entity to rely on. If it weren't for the dispute between my father and the Divine King, he could have been a good choice. Silently thinking, Selene followed her father, flying towards the center of the earth. At the same time, similar scenes were taking place in many locations. The higher the divine power level of a deity, the bigger the gap between levels. A powerful deity with the potential of level 18 or 19, even in later times, would be an influential existence in chaos. Regardless of their motives, whether their relations were friendly or not, gods left their divine palaces one after another, flying towards Mount Othrys. And so, on this day, in the 1500th year of the God King era established by Cronus himself, the gods converged. Chapter 38 Chaotic Source Force. Atop Mount Othrys, the sun and moon took turns in the sky, and the tremors of the origin sea grew denser. As time passed, the number of deities around the Mount of the Gods also gradually increased. Surrounding the Mount of the Gods, the positions of the gods were clearly demarcated. The ocean deity sovereign's lineage, the lineage of the ancient sea gods, the mountain gods, and the god of stars, each claimed their own direction, not intermingling. As for the other deities, they were scattered among them, somewhat easing the heavy atmosphere of the divine factions. Out of the four major factions, the lineage of the god of stars was unconcerned with worldly affairs. They resided in the sky, led by the god of sun, without conflicts with other lineages. The only celestial god who could potentially conflict with them, Ceus, had only 2 children, and the stars treated him with exceptional respect. However, the remaining 3 factions were different. Subtly, the mountain gods and ancient sea gods stood together, in opposition to the growing divine lineage of the ocean deity sovereign. The conflict between 2 sea gods had been long-standing, and on the earth, due to the increasing number of river, lake, and spring gods, the tensions between Oceanus and the mountain gods also accumulated. As such, Uria and Pontus, these 2 brothers, also joined forces to face their nephew's ever-strengthening lineage. That is also why, even with 2 great divine powers, Oceanus had yet to truly move against his uncle. It wasn't merely out of concern for Mother Earth's stance, but more so because of Uria's presence. Of course, there was also Cronus on the Mount of the Gods. Everyone knew that although the divine king had been forced to accept the current state of gods governing themselves, he would not always accept it. If the gods went to war, should they give him this opportunity, then he would surely do something. The sovereigns of several divine factions were well aware of this. In the somewhat tense atmosphere among the gods, 3 months passed in a blink of an eye. The perfection of the Codex gradually approached its end. Around the body of the goddess of law, chains of law visibly converged, tightly connecting with the increasingly profound Codex of creation. With the tip of her finger as her brush and the source power as her ink, under the gaze of the gods of chaos, Themis freely wrote down her achievements of 1,000 years. At one moment, when she inscribed the last character, time and space seemed to freeze for an instant. The surroundings of the Mount of the Gods immediately fell into a strange silence. Only the sound of the chains of law pulling remained unchanged. In this special atmosphere, Themis was not affected. The legal clauses were already written, with just one last step remaining. She pressed her hand on the brass pages of the book, which had somehow grown to the height of a person, and the divine artifact began to flicker in response to the will of the goddess of law. Themis could feel that at this moment, she was infinitely close to the origin sea. Every word she spoke could be heard by the world. In the name of the highest order of law, under the witness of chaos, I hereby make a covenant with the world. Whosoever has lived for 100 days, establish a law. From this moment it shall take effect, for all eternity. The voice was soft as it left her lips, but when it truly spread, the very reality of chaos seemed to tremble with it. Immediately, the chains of order around Themis began to chime in an orderly fashion, and shades of gray mist began to emerge from the laws. The mist was fickle, eventually taking the form of serpents. They slithered around the Codex of creation, hissing and howling at it. The gods couldn't help but feel solemn in their hearts. That was the chaotic source force remaining in reality, a malignant remnant from the beginning of creation. They were the placenta that birthed Tartarus and also the core of those places beyond reality, which turned back even the gods. The chaotic source force lingering here was just a fraction, 1 or 2% of what it had been at the beginning, but it was enough to intimidate any deity. Chaos is naturally hostile to order, and that's why it surrounded the Codex of creation. But the disparity in power made them instinctively halt their advance. After all, a complete divine artifact of the Trinity was a true equal to the great divine power, and even if not yet perfected, it was not something these remnants of chaotic source force could oppose. Time ticked by second after second, the mist serpents around also gradually increasing in number. When the last traces of gray mist trickled out, the chains of law returned to calm. There were no trumpets or sudden surges of power, but everyone knew the lawmaking had been a success. In the past 100 days, Themis's godhood origin and Cronus's divine king authority had both been gradually elevated. All gods could feel that even though her divine power had not increased, the goddess of justice had opened the threshold to great divine power. What remained was simply the accumulation of time. Congratulations, my sister. The gods shall remember your glorious deed. Surrounded the Mount of the Gods, Oceanus was the first to speak out his congratulations. Despite the mist serpent's unpredictable roaming, which kept him from approaching the mount, his resonant voice still carried far enough. Congratulations, Themis, your grace. It is my honor to witness your great work. Congratulations. Your deeds today will surely be immortalized within chaos forever. The ocean deity sovereign's voice seemed to remind the assembled deities, as the sounds of celebration started to ring out incessantly. Atop the Mount of the Gods, Themis, despite being very exhausted, still mustered the energy to exchange pleasantries with the various gods. Her efforts of a millennium had finally borne fruit. Feeling the increase in her godhood's origin, she even managed to smile for a few gods from the underworld who were usually not to her liking. The godhoods of deceit and lust naturally conflicted with that of law, but since they were brought by the god of light and the goddess of daylight, the goddess of justice reluctantly accepted their somewhat begrudging congratulations. Yet in her memory, there should be more than 5 deities from the underworld. She wondered what had detained the others. The voices of the gods offering their congratulations kept on coming, but Themis soon realized their awkward predicament. With the legislation concluded, the gods were supposed to come to the Mount of the Gods, but due to the presence of chaotic source force, including Cronus, none dared to come close. Themis had no solution for this. She signaled to Cronus with her eyes, ready to invite the gods to the divine palace behind Mount Othrys first, where the celebration feast was already prepared. Congratulations, Lady Themis. Just as she was about to speak, a familiar voice came over. The goddess of justice turned around with a bit of surprise, as she had thought the other would wait until the crowd dissipated before coming over. Where her gaze landed, a ripple of space appeared, and a young deity in black quietly materialized before her, seemingly unaffected by the chaotic source force. A few of the great divine powers in the distance frowned, for even with their might, they had only noticed the newcomer a moment earlier. This level of spatial temporal power they had only seen in Cronus before. It should be shared joy, Prince Lane, she said with a slight smile, relieved. She pointed to the nearby Codex of Creation. 200 years overdue. It's time the item returned to its rightful owner. And these chaotic source forces, if you hadn't come, I wouldn't have known what to do with them, Themis said. Hearing this, many of the deities who had never seen Lane before were curious about his identity and his connection to the goddess of law's divine artifact. The few who recognized Lane's presence were also puzzled. Chaotic source force was like poison to the gods who were born in this era. Lane, paying no heed to the other deities, nodded towards Themis. With a gesture, the Codex of Creation shrunk to the size of a normal book and fell into his palm. He tapped the spine with his fingertip, and a page fell from the divine artifact. A streak of golden light flashed across the page, and the surrounding mist serpents were sucked in like water into a whale, leaving no trace behind. Clearly, in the hands of the true owner of the divine artifact, it exhibited an even greater might within the domain of order. "Will you stay for my victory celebration?" Themis asked. "No, I'm just here to take these things you couldn't handle. I've been looking forward to the chaotic source force for quite some time," Lane replied, shaking his head as he declined Themis' invitation. He had no interest in attending a celebration of this era. With the items in hand, Lane was about to bid farewell, but in the next moment, an inexplicable oppressive force suddenly arrived, solidifying the space around them. This level of confinement actually had little effect on him. With just a bit more effort, Lane could easily break free. But he didn't do so. Instead, he simply turned to look towards the source of the power. As expected, in his line of sight stood the family of the god of Sunday. Leading them was none other than the principal god, Hyperion. Chapter 39 Evaluation. As the god of sun displayed his divine power unabashedly, the atmosphere both inside and outside the Mount of the Gods, which had been lively, began to weigh down with gravity. The deities who were preparing to come forward also stopped in their tracks. Although the mist serpent had been cleared away, they were equally reluctant to get involved in the obvious conflict before them. The character and ambition of the god of sun were well known. He was not one to engage in pleasant sociability. Aside from his wife Thea, even his own children held more fear than respect for him, so naturally, the gods were not going to speak on his behalf. As for Lane, it was even less necessary to mention. Among the deities present who knew him, aside from Themis, the majority would be happy to see someone laying hands on him. This deity, who seemed to be older than the primordial gods, had never truly made a move. Even though fate made the gods fear him, it wasn't as intuitively powerful as strength. Now that someone was willing to be the one to test Lane's strength, even the ancient mountain god Aria couldn't help but entertain the idea of enjoying the show. "Is there a problem?" Under the gaze of the gods, Lane asked in an unhurried tone, facing the faintly oppressive divine power coming from Hyperion. With a calm tone and an unrippled expression, Lane's attitude was unmistakable. He didn't seem to take the god of sun seriously at all, at least that's how it appeared. "You know why I am here, Lane. I once went to the underworld to find you, but you didn't even dare to meet me face to face." With narrowed eyes, facing Lane's indifference, Hyperion responded with an even stronger pressure of divine power. Light and heat surged around Lane, rushing straight toward him. But soon, Hyperion realized that, despite his continuing surge of divine power, it all disappeared at the edge of Lane's robe. No, not disappeared. Hyperion could feel that the power of the great sun was still there, still pressing forward. Only a distance as narrow as a finger's breadth seemed to be stretched 1,000,000 times longer. No matter how close his power got, it was always just a bit short of reaching the other party. Facing such a situation, the god of sun glanced sideways at the divine king, using his peripheral vision. This kind of technique seemed like it involved the authority of space, but as far as Hyperion remembered, it was Cronus that was the god of space and time. But none of that mattered now. As the forces of both parties met, the intermediate divine power level of Lane was clearly perceptible to him. It was somewhat threatening, but that was all, making Hyperion's resolve strengthen slightly. "Lane, you must be very clear about my purpose. Thousands of years ago, you used eloquence to confuse the divine king, obtained 3 conditions, and shamelessly stole the concept of the moon. Today, I have come to correct that mistake." In front of the gods, Hyperion still had to speak some reason. Although the ancient Titan gods who had truly experienced that time knew that he had been one of those in agreement then. The god of sun was very much in favor of the underworld sun, broadening his authority, and not yet free at that time. He did not know that the future moon would become his daughter. However, the underworld sun had not appeared for a long time, and with the birth of Selene, Hyperion's thoughts had changed as well. On the other side, Lane remained unmoved by the god of sun's questioning. From the time the other party had gone to the underworld, he had anticipated this day to some extent. The other party wanted the moon in his hands, but how could he not want a chess piece to deter the gods? If it were any other Titan, with the gap in divine power level, Lane might not have any good solutions, but Hyperion picking this time and place to create trouble could only be seen as planting the seeds of his own misfortune. Feeling the laws of the current world that had not entirely dissipated around him, Lane did not respond but instead turned to look at Cronus. "Is this your idea?" Upon hearing this, the divine king standing off to the side was first taken aback, then promptly and decisively denied. "No, this matter is not of my concern. The divine king's promises are never discounted." Although he longed to say yes, then join forces with Hyperion to bring down Lane, and see if he could reclaim his origin of time and space, Cronus, after much consideration, abandoned this thought. Now that Hyperion had taken the initiative to step forward, Cronus could decide based on how events unfolded. If Lane was not as fearsome as he thought, he believed his own Queen of Gods would certainly defy the divine king's command, voluntarily doing something to Cronus's regret. But if Lane dealt with the problem brought by the god of sun, then he would not act rashly. "Lane!" With a low shout, the god of sun, who was ignored by Lane, once again felt a surge of anger. He had anticipated many possible reactions, such as refusing to hand over the concept of moon, or finding some way to leave directly, or perhaps telling the gods about the past agreements and prophecies, attacking his inconsistency, but Hyperion had never expected to be completely ignored by Lane. He wanted to take action directly, but the fruitless probing from before still allowed the god of sun to barely regain some rationality. Cooling down, he turned his head to glance at Crius, the god of meteorology. The result was a relief. This relative gave him an affirmative look. Once, because of the calendar, Crius also harbored some dissatisfaction towards Lane. It would be too much to provoke a conflict directly, but to lend some support in a fight, he dared to do so. Goddess of justice, my sister Themis. This greedy deity first stole Mnemosyne's memory, then conspired to take my daughter's moon. I hope you can make a fair judgment and make him pay for his misdeeds, Hyperion said. Now with a helper, Hyperion still thought it wasn't enough. He tried to get Themis to stand on his side as well. Clearly, the result was not as he wished. Gods and godhood mutually influence each other. At least that's how Chaos's native deities are. Besides the former Heavenly Father, no one could make the Master of Law go against her nature. Moreover, even on a personal emotional level, between a friend who lent a divine artifact and the god of sun whom she hadn't seen in a millennium, Themis wouldn't hesitate. The god of spirit was born before us. The ownership of memory is Chaos's decision. As for the moon, that is an agreement witnessed by the mother goddess and us. Shaking her head, Themis had no intention whatsoever of showing favoritism towards her brother. She turned her head to look at Lane. If he required her help, she wouldn't mind standing on the side of justice. Themis, whose divine power had not yet broken through, might not be a match for the god of sun, but she was confident in stopping Thea. An agreement? It was nothing but him threatening us with a prophecy. With a scoff, Hyperion seemed to have forgotten how meek and humiliated he had been during the time when the Heavenly Father was still present. As the leader of the lineage of the god of stars, he had long since lost his former wariness and meticulousness. Since you are unwilling to help me, my sister, you'd best not interfere with me, he said. Even if you have received a promotion in godhood, you are still not a match for me as of now. And you, Lane? Hyperion sneered as he looked over, ready to stop tolerating any further. In the presence of the gods, I will show you that power is far more effective than words. The next moment, the sky brightened. Chapter 40: The Power of the Codex of Creation. As his voice fell, Hyperion no longer hesitated. Vast divine power surged from him, echoing the celestial bodies in the starry sky. Having made his decision, he did not intend to probe any further. The sun in the sky instantly erupted with 1,000-fold heat, and all intelligent creatures of chaos could see that the sun, originally suspended overhead, began to deviate from its position, falling towards the earth, gradually accelerating. As the original god of sun, the mighty Titan deity, Hyperion did not need any sun chariot to drive this celestial body, or rather, relying on external objects to harness the symbol of his godhood was in itself a sign of insufficient strength. At the same time, the ancient Titan gods Thea and Crius also secretly exerted their authority. Although they did not take direct action, light and sun were so compatible that meteorology could also amplify the sun's power. The sun's radiance became intensely brilliant. Drawn by divine power, it hurtled straight towards Lane. The force of this single blow, with the combined strength of the three titans, elevated Hyperion's power more than just a level. Even the several beings of great divine power present could not help but show a grave expression. Although the birth of his eldest son had caused Hyperion's divine power to fall back to the threshold of great divine power, this attack that pulled the sun could make any deity here take 3 steps back. You still have time to give up now, Hyperion finally smiled as he looked at Lane on the Mount of the Gods. Once the sun sets, you will have no chance to repent. Raising an eyebrow, Lane had to admit that Thea and the god of sun were indeed a natural pair. Together, they were almost approaching divine power level 19. If it were not for Hyperion digging his own grave, Lane would not have dared to stay put. Of course, not being able to withstand it did not mean he could not avoid it. The sun faintly locked onto this space, but after all, it did not have the authority over time and space. If he circumvented through history, traveling through time, Lane could easily retreat tranquil. However, compared to avoiding it, he had a better solution. Nothing is absolute, Hyperion. Gods must pay a price for what they have done. The same was true for Uranus, and you are no exception. The lessons of history are right before your eyes. Yet you have never learned a thing. Shaking his head slightly, Lane calmly responded. The next moment, the flow of time around him was instantly distorted. Under the power of his authority, 1 second stretched into more than a quarter of an hour. This was just a basic application of the power of time. With ample time, he slowly raised his hand, and the Codex of Creation floated and turned pages in midair. In the blink of an eye, countless pages filled with spirit script were flipped through, finally stopping on the section that detailed the rules governing celestial bodies. Everything has its order, and even the divine king, if he misuses his authority, will be punished by the world, to say nothing of a god of sun. And with the Codex of Creation in hand, Lane could make this retribution more concrete, more severe, more efficient. The dissension of the great sun was actually not a big deal. As long as Hyperion controlled it properly and did not let it truly collide with the Earth, the backlash he would need to endure was almost negligible. However, the fact that the sun god suppressed his eldest son for hundreds of years, causing the celestial body that was supposed to rise in the east and set in the west to hang in the sky, was his greatest violation of order. And on this Mount of the Gods, where the current laws had just been established, the remnants of the world's laws would amplify the power of the Codex of Creation, subjecting those who strayed from order to compounded punishment. The revolution of the sun and moon follows its statutes. According to the Codex, each should follow its path. As he spoke, Lane's divine power flowed into the book in his hand, absorbed by this object that was close to a Genesis artifact. The next moment, a sound of chains clinking echoed through the void, and the sun that was hurtling towards Lane slowed down abruptly, losing the momentum it initially had. Hyperion, as a god of sun, also noticed that the more the sun deviated from its original trajectory, the stronger a force seemed to resist its movement. Although the great sun was still approaching Lane, the might of this strike had already been greatly diminished. "Humph, just a little trick," Hyperion scoffed. Snorting coldly, Hyperion glanced at the Mother of Light beside him. Seeing this, Thea understood and agreed, and the two of them began to mobilize their divine power together, accelerating the descent of the sun once again. If Lane had been an equally strong deity, or held a complete Genesis artifact in his hand, Hyperion would have definitely turned tail and fled. But now, even if it meant using almost half of his strength to counter the chains of law, he still had ample confidence. However, he had yet to realize the gravity of the situation until this moment. Violators are guilty. Those who are guilty shall be punished. Accompanied by Lane's second proclamation, Hyperion at first didn't take it seriously, but then his expression suddenly changed. He had been prepared to once again resist the power of order, but just now, he was horrified to discover that his control over the sun was waning. Apart from chaos, no one could shake a god's divine authority. Hyperion thought he might be hallucinating, but then he quickly realized the problem. "Is it Helios? What have you done to him?" Crying out in alarm, Hyperion understood. It wasn't Chaos who was diminishing his divine authority, but that the sun itself had inherent issues. Since Helios's birth, the sun had two masters, one symbolizing its existence, the other its operation. But due to the oppression of his eldest son, the sun had never truly orbited since the day it was born. Without a doubt, this was a violation of the existing order. But under normal circumstances, being the original sun god, a few hundred years wasn't enough time for Hyperion to pay the price for this. However, under the influence of the Codex of Creation, the feedback of order had been amplified. Hyperion's control over the sun began shifting towards his child. Although this transfer was reversible, he was forced to stop the descent of the sun. He could continue the attack so long as he had enough trust in Helios. But obviously, there was no such trust between the god of sun and his son. Although Helios had always been obedient to him, Hyperion knew all too well not to trust that, from his own experience. For the sun god, who had personally staged fatherly love and filial piety, a daughter might be okay since there was no conflict in divine roles. But for his son Helios, he had long been on guard. Good. Very good. Themis, is this your justice? Knowing he could only return today without accomplishing anything, Hyperion cast an angry glance at his sister. Since the Oracle Stone Tablet was remade, it was entirely different from the original. Even the ancient gods on Mount of the Gods, who had seen the tablet before, did not recognize that the Codex of Creation was that same stone tablet. This was always meant for Prince Lane. I merely returned it to its rightful owner, Themis explained, frowning slightly. Would he kindly lend you the divine artifact, considering his and our fellow Titans' relationship with us? Hyperion snorted coldly, his rage not clouding his mind. He gave Lane one final look and turned to leave. Any more harsh words now would only become a joke. But today's matter isn't over. Watching Hyperion walk away, Lane shook his head slightly. He could probably guess what the other was thinking. But unfortunately, when to act, you may decide. When to end, that's for me to say. And so the next moment, he reached out his hand and took out a gift that had been stored for 1,500 years.